Hey, welcome back to the Ready State. Today I want to talk about trying to figure out how all of the exercising in the world fits together. On one end, maybe I have high-level sport. On the other end, I have, hey, I want to improve my cardiac health. How do those things interface? For me, when I start to understand relationships, then I can start to appreciate sort of the Venn diagram aspects where we start to see overlap, and those end up being very specific for me in terms of richness of understanding, and then which a tool is appropriate for my specific outcome. So, without further ado, let me get in, and let me start by working at this end, which is the sport end. So, traditionally, when we have been at this other end, when we're training for sport, the only goal should be to make the sport better. Does my athlete play their sport better? Sometimes that's easier to do, right? I can see that my athletes are more explosive and more powerful. If this was cycling, then I would expect my athletes to become better cyclists. And in the context of what we would call sports-specific training, I am using movements in the gym to ameliorate sort of overloaded patterns. So if I'm spending a ton of time cycling and compressed, maybe we're spending some time keeping the hip open so we don't end up with knee pain, loss of power in the hip, wobbliness, et cetera, et cetera. So sport-specific training then is not trying to mimic the demands of the sport by doing wobbly things if I'm a surfer. Go ahead and play the sport. The sport will take care of that, right? And modern strength and conditioning appreciates that sport-specific training isn't gimmicky like we saw maybe in the 80s and 90s, right? So the idea here is that if I'm engaged in sport-specific training, the only outcome is, does my sport get better? And more importantly, am I limiting compensation for my high-level athletes? A good example of this is if you happen to be working with Olympic-level sprinters, as my good friend Stuart McMillan points out, how much dorsiflexion do they need? Well, I need to understand if I'm working with a specific sport population, what the demands of the sport are, so that I can limit compensation, make sure that my athletes are not falling below those minimums during their sports season, so that they have enough dorsiflexion to not compensate when they run and sprint, and, for example, they have enough dorsiflexion that they're not compensating or collapsing the arch or working around a problem when they're engaged in the training for the sport. Ultimately, though, it's all about the sport. So, if that's sport-specific training, then eventually the sports season is going to end, and we end up with what we call sports preparation training. And sports preparation training means that I need to pay attention to how well the movements that I'm engaged in end up being able to translate into sports. So if my feet are turned out like Daffy Duck or Donald Duck, and I'm training my athletes in that position, but their job is to ski or to cut or to jump or to land or to ride a bike, what I'm really potentially doing is teaching my athletes movements and reinforcing those movement patterns and movement learning in ways that are going to interfere ultimately with the athlete's ability to generate force and end up transmitting the skills we're seeing in the gym. And if there's a hole in the world right now that we want to pay attention to, is making sure that we don't end up fetishizing our gym culture, gym movements, in the idea that as long as we're just fitter and stronger, we'll be better at sport. That used to be true, and now what we understand is, boy, the gym is a place to reinforce mechanics and technique and principles so that when I then start to drop out some of the complexity, I can cycle right back into sport-specific training. So maybe I'm working on other energy systems, maybe I'm working on general strength, things that I'm not going to need when I'm at this sport-specific training model. On this side of this sports preparation training model, I'm going to put in this GPP, which is classically general physical preparedness. So if I was trying to create a person who was ready to be more sophisticated about their training for sport, this is where I would begin. And good movement systems like kettlebell training, even CrossFit have classically described themselves as GPP. Looking at energy systems, looking at better full range of motion, engaged in gymnastics and Olympic lifting and functional training. The key here, though, is that this GPP, which is a great basis for general physical preparedness to be able to do a whole host of sports, is maybe I don't have to be as technical in my understanding around sports preparation training. That I can get a lot of work done without really having to care about some of the details. The key here is that this is a gigantic interface, that where this ends up coming in and this comes up coming in, is that a lot of my classic general physical preparedness does work for sports preparation training. All I have to do is care about the details a little bit more. I'm working on shapes and mechanics, trying to make it so that my training translates into how well I can pick up new sports. If all I'm doing is going to the gym, then this I probably have to be less specific about caring about all the details, about turning my feet out, or collapsing my arches, or flaring my elbows. Movement injury aside, movement dysfunction aside, what's nice about this is just general. Like, more of everything makes better, more robust people. And that's fair. And we've gotten away with that for a long time. But these things sect and overlap so much that it's easy for me to take my GPP and spin it back in. Now, the problem with GPP is that it often does not have an eye on what this looks like. And what's happening is that a lot of people are using this GPP to prepare for sport. And what we're seeing is that athletes are blown out, where our work is too high, we're getting too much work done in the gym, we're too fatigued, and it affects our practice and it affects our ability to kind of go play a sport effectively. So this is important to you because sometimes you'll see athletes who are engaged in sports-specific training doing things that aren't as hard or aren't as rigorous in the gym, and we're asking ourselves, well, who's the better athlete? And it's easy sometimes to say, hey, you're deficient over here, because you're not keeping in mind the context of the athlete needs to go out and play a sport. They have to go out and actually do the practice. And so if you drop into the NFL, you're gonna see a lot more sports-specific training done, and a lot of the GPP that sometimes we think is necessary can't be here because the athlete's gonna need to practice and actually play in a game. And to the end, that if you're using GPP to get athletes prepared for sports and they're too fatigued and don't jump and land and can't be cut and powerful, then this is a problem, right? With the caveat that sometimes people are really weak and we have to get them stronger. I get that. But on this other side, and again, I think it's easy to go onto the internet and watch the freaks out there in this GPP land without the sort of context of what's the point, why am I training? On the other side of GPP, I'm just gonna put this big category we call fitnessing. And if the goal is aesthetics, if the goal is, hey, I just want to make sure that I'm insulin sensitive and I'm getting cardioprotective, this can be things that look like Barry's Boot Camp, right? This could be Orange Theory, right? You start to get the idea. This might be a Peloton, spin class, and there'll be sort of variability in terms of, hey, I'm using more range of motion, but ultimately this comes down to, I worked really hard and got my butt kicked in class, that must be enough. And we can see how there's a huge difference between that and continuing to develop real world GPP skills that ultimately could be spun up into these other things. On the other side of fitnessing, I'll put movement fun, like Zumba. And without casting shades at Zumba, this is a wonderful community building, sweating, great activity exercise, learn to mirror, learn to move. Go to a Zumba class and don't grin your ass off the whole time. You'll see that it is unbelievable. My heart rate comes up, I'm load bearing, it's fantastic, did I use my body through a full range of motion? Did I develop other skills? Am I loading and pushing and pulling? No. Apply that same rubric to here and you see that there's deficiency in the fitnessing landscape too. Right? And this is confusing for a lot of people because they think, I worked my butt off, I must be doing GPP. As we're trying to move in this direction in complexity, all of these things have a place. Show up to a friend's gym, jump into a fun workout, enjoy some fitnessing GPP, but do not confuse that with the fact that, hey, at some point it's not just about did you move the thing over your head, it's about did you express a full range of motion and good technique as you put your things over your head. So as you're going through Instagram, as you're walking through and watching a lot of these corrective exercises, a lot of these training things, ask yourself, what is going on here? Am I seeing sport-specific training? Is this just good old-fashioned GPP, right? Kettlebell flow stuff, that's great. Is it preparing my athletes to be explosive and powerful and do all the things? Maybe I don't need that. So this is efficiently all I need. I look good naked, and I can work really hard, and I can go up and down the stairs. Fantastic. But at some point, we need to be able to understand how all of these things link. I spend a lot of time messing around here. I think it's super fun. When I go to yoga class, I love it, right, in this space. But I am really, really careful that as I bring that context back and I'm working with athletes and I'm working with children, I'm working with teams, I'm not confusing doing a whole lot of work with, am I making this athlete better at sport? So as you're parsing this out for yourself, start to ask, well, hey, how do I use my time efficiently? How do I use my skill efficiently to either make my athlete a better person, Zumba, or better at my sport? See you guys tomorrow.